What happens when Hollywood's most grounded action star sits down with cable news's most outrageous personality? It only took 43 seconds for one controversial comment to trigger the most explosive exit in talk show history. Mark Wahlberg walked onto the Awkward Hour set that evening, expecting a typical promotional interview. He was there to talk about his latest film, a gritty action thriller where he played a former Marine turned humanitarian worker. The audience applauded as he took his seat across from Gutfeld, who was grinning in that signature way that always seemed to suggest he was about to say something calculated to provoke. "Mark Wahlberg, everybody," Gutfeld announced, clapping slowly. "The man who went from underwear model to Oscar nominee. Quite the journey." Mark smiled politely. "Well, I've been fortunate, a lot of hard work, but yeah, blessed." Gutfeld leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Let's talk about your new movie. Another one of those films where you play the everyman hero saving the day. Don't you ever get tired of playing the same character?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Mark shifted in his seat. "I don't think I play the same character. Each role has different motivations, different backgrounds." Sure, Gutfeld interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "But come on, tough guy with a heart of gold. That's basically your entire filmography, right? I mean, how many variations of Mark Wahlberg can audiences really sit through?" Mark's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "I choose roles that resonate with me. Stories about redemption, about people overcoming their circumstances. If that's repetitive to you, I guess we just value different things." "Oh, here we go," Gutfeld said, smirking at the camera. "The humble hero speech. You know what I find interesting, Mark? You talk about redemption a lot, but weren't you the guy who assaulted people when you were younger? I mean, real violence, not movie violence." The audience went silent. Mark's face hardened. "I've addressed that many times. I was a troubled kid who made terrible mistakes. I've spent my adult life trying to be better and do better." Gutfeld wasn't backing down. "Right, but you asked for a pardon, didn't you? And then withdrew it when people called you out. Seems like you wanted forgiveness without actually earning it." "That's not what happened," Mark said, his voice controlled but firm. "I withdrew the application because I didn't want it to be a distraction from the actual work I was doing in my community. The pardon wasn't about erasing what I did. I carry that with me every day." "How convenient," Gutfeld said, looking at his notes. "So you carry it with you, but you also don't want to talk about it unless you're promoting a movie about redemption. That's quite the marketing strategy." Mark leaned forward. "I talk about it because people like you bring it up. I don't hide from my past. But I also don't think I should have to apologize for trying to move forward and be a better person." Gutfeld chuckled. "Move forward? You're worth $300 million. You move forward just fine. What about the people you hurt? Did they move forward as comfortably?" The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Mark took a deep breath. "I've tried to reach out. I've apologized. Some accepted it, some didn't. I can't control that. All I can do is try to live differently." "That's beautiful, really," Gutfeld said with exaggerated sincerity. "But let's talk about something else. Your faith. You're very public about being Catholic, right?" "I am," Mark said cautiously. "So you go to church, you pray, you probably think you're going to heaven despite, the assault history," Gutfeld continued. "Do you think God just gives celebrities a pass? Like, is there a VIP section in heaven for people who made good movies after doing bad things?" Mark's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "My faith is personal. It's between me and God. I don't think fame has anything to do with salvation." "But you do think you're saved?" Gutfeld pressed. "You think all is forgiven because you started a hamburger chain and made some inspirational Instagram posts?" "I think," Mark said slowly, clearly fighting to maintain his composure, "that faith is about constantly trying to be better. It's not about perfection. It's about recognizing your flaws and working on them." Gutfeld leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. "That's a nice way to avoid accountability. Just say you're working on it. Meanwhile, you're living in a mansion, driving expensive cars, and lecturing everyone else about hard work and values." "I've never lectured anyone," Mark shot back. "I share my story. If people find it inspiring, great. If they don't, that's their choice." "Your story," Gutfeld repeated mockingly. "The story of a guy who got famous, got rich, and now pretends he's just like everyone else. You wake up at 2 in the morning to work out. You've told that story 1,000 times. You know what most people are doing at 2 in the morning? Sleeping. Because they worked all day at jobs that actually matter. They're not preparing to film a movie where they'll make $20 million for 3 months of work. Mark stood up. You know what, Greg? I came here to talk about a film. A film about real heroes, people who sacrifice everything to help others. But you don't want to talk about that. You want to tear people down because that's what you do. That's your brand. Sit down, Gutfeld said, though his grin had faded slightly. We're not done. Yeah, we are, Mark said, removing his microphone. I don't need to sit here and be disrespected by someone who makes a living out of mocking people. Gutfeld recovered quickly, his smirk returning. Oh, so the tough guy can't handle a few questions? What happened to the Mark Wahlberg who fought? People in the streets? Now you run away when someone challenges you? Mark stopped, turning back to face Gutfeld. You want to know the difference between me and you? I admit my mistakes. I own them. You sit here every night and throw stones at people from behind a desk, and you think that makes you clever. It doesn't. It makes you a coward. The audience gasped. Gutfeld's face reddened. Excuse me? You come on my show and call me a coward? I call it like I see it, Mark said. You don't have the guts to face the things you criticize. You mock people's faith, their work ethic, their past mistakes. But what do you actually do? What have you sacrificed? What have you built besides a career out of being mean? Gutfeld stood up now, his voice rising. I've built a successful show that millions of people watch because I'm not afraid to ask the questions everyone else is too polite to ask. If that offends you, maybe you're not as tough as you pretend to be. There's a difference between asking tough questions and being intentionally cruel, Mark said. You crossed that line the second I sat down. This wasn't an interview. This was an ambush. An ambush, Gutfeld laughed. I asked about your publicly known history. If you can't handle that, don't go on talk shows. Actually, here's an idea. Why don't you just stay in your mansion and count your money? We'll be fine without another Mark Wahlberg movie. Mark walked toward the edge of the stage. You know what's sad? You had a chance to have a real conversation. We could have talked about the film, about the real issues it addresses. But you'd rather play to your audience's worst instincts. You'd rather make people angry and divided because that's easier than actually contributing something meaningful. Meaningful? Gutfeld scoffed. You're an actor. You pretend to be other people for a living. Don't lecture me about meaning. At least I'm trying to tell stories that might inspire people or make them think, Mark countered. What do? You make people cynical. You make them distrust everyone and everything. Is that really what you want your legacy to be? Gutfeld stepped out from behind his desk. My legacy? Let me tell you something, Mark. At least I'm honest about what I do. I'm a commentator. I give my opinions. You, on the other hand, you're trying to sell yourself as this reformed good guy while conveniently forgetting that your entire career is built on glorifying violence. How many people have you pretended to kill in your movies? How many times have you played a character who solves problems with his fists, and you have the nerve to call me out? Mark shook his head. Those are stories, fiction. You're talking about real people's lives, real faith, real struggles, and you're doing it in the cheapest way possible. For ratings. Everything is for ratings, Gutfeld shot back. Your movies, your charity work, your social media posts. You're selling a product just like I am. The only difference is I'm honest about it. No, Mark said firmly. The difference is I'm trying to leave things better than I found them. What are you trying to do? Gutfeld laughed again, but it sounded forced. I'm trying to keep people from being fooled by celebrity saviors who think a few good deeds erase a lifetime of mistakes. People like you want everyone to forget who you really were because you're uncomfortable with it. I've never asked anyone to forget, Mark said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. I've asked for the chance to be better. That's all. If you can't understand that, if you can't see the value in people changing and growing, then I genuinely feel sorry for you. Save your pity, Gutfeld snapped. I don't need it from someone who beats people up and then becomes an action star. That's not growth. That's just good luck and better PR. Mark stared at him for a long moment. You really believe that? You really think people can't change? I think people show you who they are, Gutfeld said. And I think you're showing me right now that you can't handle criticism. This isn't criticism, Mark said. This is cruelty disguised as honesty. And I'm done with it. He turned and walked off the stage. The audience sat in stunned silence. Gutfeld called after him, Thanks for stopping by, Mark. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. but his voice lacked its usual confidence. As Mark disappeared backstage, the crew scrambled. The segment producer rushed onto the set, whispering frantically to Gutfeld. He waved her off and turned back to the camera. "Well, folks, I guess Mark Wahlberg doesn't like tough questions," Gutfeld said, trying to regain his composure. You'd think someone who survived the streets of Boston could handle a simple conversation, but apparently not. The audience remained quiet. Usually, they would laugh at Gutfeld's quips, but the mood had shifted. What had started as an interview had devolved into something uncomfortable, something that felt less like entertainment and more like a public confrontation. Gutfeld shuffled his papers, clearly thrown off his rhythm. "We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about something less controversial, like politics." He forced a laugh, but it fell flat. The camera cut away, but the damage was done. In the green room, Mark was already gathering his things. A production assistant approached nervously. "Mr. Wahlberg, is there anything we can do?" Mark looked at her, his anger fading into something like disappointment. "No, I just need to leave." "We're really sorry about how that went," she said. "That wasn't supposed to happen." Mark paused. What was supposed to happen? He was always going to go there. You know that's what he does. The production assistant didn't have an answer. Mark softened slightly. "Look, I know you're just doing your job, but that guy, your boss, he doesn't care about the truth. He doesn't care about having real conversations. He just wants to create moments that get shared online." Well, he got his moment. Back in the studio, Gutfeld was in a commercial break, arguing with his producers. "What did you expect me to do?" He walked right into it. "You went too far," the segment producer said. The personal attacks about his faith, his past, that wasn't in the pre-interview notes. "Since when do I stick to the notes?" Gutfeld replied. "This is my show. I ask what I want to ask." "And now our guest walked off," she said. "Do you know how bad that looks?" Gutfeld shrugged. "It looks like he couldn't handle the heat. That's on him." But even as he said it, he seemed less certain. The audience's silence had clearly affected him. Usually, they were on his side, laughing at his jabs and cheering his provocations. Tonight, they had watched in uncomfortable silence as he pushed a guest too far. The show resumed, but the energy was gone. Gutfeld tried to move on to other topics, but he kept circling back to the confrontation, trying to justify his approach, insisting that Mark had overreacted. "Here's the thing," he told the audience and the cameras. "Celebrities come on these shows expecting softball questions. They want to plug their movies and leave, but that's not journalism. That's not holding people accountable." Yet even his most loyal viewers could sense something was off. This hadn't felt like accountability. It had felt personal. It had felt mean. In his dressing room, Mark sat quietly, replaying the conversation in his mind. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of defending himself, tired of having to justify his journey, tired of people who seemed to believe that past mistakes should define someone forever. His phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues who had been watching. Most were supportive. Some were shocked. A few suggested he should have stayed and fought back harder, but Mark knew he had made the right choice. Engaging further would have just given Gutfeld more ammunition, more moments to clip and share, and use to build his brand on the back of controversy. The knock on his door was tentative. It was one of the show's senior producers, someone Mark had met briefly before the taping. "Mr. Wahlberg, I want to apologize," the producer said. "That wasn't what we discussed. Greg was supposed to keep it focused on the film." Mark nodded. "But he didn't, and you knew he wouldn't. That's why you book him. That's why people watch." The producer looked uncomfortable. Still, it shouldn't have gone that way. "No, it shouldn't have," Mark agreed. "But it did. And now we all have to live with it." After the producer left, Mark sat alone for a few more minutes before finally leaving the studio. As he walked to his car, he thought about all the interviews he had done over the years. Most were fine, some were great, a few were uncomfortable, but this one had crossed a line. It wasn't about the tough questions. Mark had faced plenty of those. It was about the intent behind them. Gutfeld hadn't been trying to understand or illuminate. He had been trying to humiliate. There was a cruelty in his approach that went beyond journalism or entertainment. Back in the studio, Gutfeld wrapped up his show, signing off with his usual bravado. But after the cameras stopped rolling, he sat at his desk for a moment, alone. His producers had already rushed off to deal with the inevitable fallout. Social media was exploding with reactions, and not all of them were in Gutfeld's favor. For years, he had built his career on being provocative, on saying what others wouldn't, on pushing buttons. Usually, it worked. People loved it or hated it, but they watched, they shared, they talked about it. But tonight felt different. He had wanted to challenge Mark Wahlberg, to break through the celebrity polish and get to something real. But instead of revealing truth, he had simply revealed himself. He had shown that beneath the clever quips and the confident smirk, he was someone who enjoyed making people uncomfortable, who got satisfaction from watching them squirm. The audience had seen it. They had watched him continue to push even after it was clear the conversation had turned toxic. They had heard the personal attacks disguised as questions. And they had seen a guest decide that his dignity was worth more than the promotional opportunity. Gutfeld told himself it didn't matter. Controversy was good for ratings. People would talk about this for days. His name would trend online. The show would get attention. Isn't that what mattered? But in the quiet of the empty studio, with the lights dimming and the crew packing up, he couldn't quite convince himself. Because for all his talk about honesty and accountability, he had to face a simple truth. He had been cruel for the sake of being cruel. Not clever, not insightful, just mean. Mark Wahlberg had walked onto that stage, willing to be open, willing to discuss his past and his present, willing to engage, and Gutfeld had weaponized that willingness, turning it into an attack. He had taken Mark's honesty about his mistakes and used them as ammunition rather than as evidence of growth. The question Gutfeld had asked mockingly about legacy now seemed to echo back at him. What was his legacy? What was he building with all this provocation? Was it really holding people accountable, or was it just entertainment at others' expense? He stood up, gathered his notes, and headed to his office. Tomorrow, the cycle would continue. There would be new guests, new targets, new opportunities to be provocative. But tonight, for just a moment, he wondered if Mark Wahlberg had been right. Maybe there was a difference between asking tough questions and being intentionally cruel. Maybe he had crossed that line without even realizing it. Or maybe he had realized it and done it anyway. That thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. As Mark drove home, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had stood up for himself. He had refused to participate in his own humiliation. Yes, people would talk. Yes, there would be think pieces and social media debates, but he had maintained his dignity. He had drawn a line. He thought about the film he had been trying to promote, the one about humanitarian workers risking their lives to help others. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had gone on that show to talk about people who dedicate themselves to making the world better, and instead, he had encountered someone who seemed dedicated to making it worse. But that was okay, because in walking away, in refusing to accept the premise that he deserved to be treated with contempt, Mark had made a statement. Not everyone would understand it. Not everyone would support it. But he understood it, and that was enough. The intersection of celebrity and media had always been complicated. Celebrities needed media to promote their work. Media needed celebrities to attract audiences. But somewhere along the way, some shows had decided that the best way to attract audiences was through conflict and humiliation. They had turned interviews into blood sports, where the goal wasn't conversation but conquest. Mark had refused to play that game, and in doing so, he had exposed it for what it was. Not brave journalism or fearless commentary, but simple bullying dressed up in fancy clothes. As the city lights blurred past his window, Mark felt grateful. Grateful for his career, his family, his second chances. Grateful for the ability to walk away from situations that diminished him. Grateful that he no longer had to prove himself to people who had already decided what they thought of him. He had learned a long time ago that some people would never see past his mistakes. They would always view him through that lens, no matter what he did or how he lived. And that was their choice. He couldn't control it, and he had stopped trying. What he could control was how he responded to it. He could choose dignity over defensiveness. He could choose self-respect over engagement. He could choose to walk away rather than be dragged down. Greg Gutfeld would continue doing his show. He would continue pushing buttons and stirring controversy. Some people would love him for it. Others would hate him, but Mark wouldn't be thinking about him. He had more important things to focus on. The next morning, the story would be everywhere. Clips of the confrontation would circulate endlessly. People would debate who was right and who was wrong. Some would say Mark overreacted. Others would say Gutfeld went too far. The truth, as always, would be somewhere in the complicated middle. But Mark knew something that the commentators and the social media warriors wouldn't necessarily understand. Sometimes walking away isn't about winning or losing. It's about refusing to let someone else define you. It's about knowing your worth and not letting anyone diminish it. He had spent too much of his life fighting, both literally and figuratively. He had learned the hard way that not every battle is worth engaging in. Some fights don't have winners, only casualties, and this would have been one of those fights. So, he had chosen a different path. Not because he was afraid or weak, but because he was strong enough to recognize a no-win situation and wise enough to remove himself from it. The studio would release statements. Publicists would spin the narrative. The next day's news cycle would move on to the next controversy. But the moment itself would remain. A small but significant example of someone choosing self-preservation over spectacle. Mark pulled into his driveway, turned off the car, and sat for a moment in the silence. Tomorrow, he would continue promoting his film. He would do other interviews, talk to other hosts, share the same stories. But tonight, he would rest easy knowing he had stood up for himself in the way that mattered most by refusing to participate in his own diminishment. In the end, that was all any of them could do: maintain their integrity, protect their peace, and know when to walk away. The lights in his house were warm and welcoming. His family was inside, probably already aware of what had happened, but ready to support him regardless. That was what mattered. Not the opinions of strangers or the provocations of antagonists, but the people who knew him, who understood his journey, who loved him despite his imperfections. He got out of the car and walked toward his door, leaving the controversy behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new conversations. But tonight, he was just Mark. Not a celebrity, not a former troubled youth, not a defensive guest on a hostile show. Just a man who had chosen his dignity over someone else's entertainment. And that was enough. The story would live on in countless retellings, analyzed, and debated. But the truth of that moment was simple. One man had chosen integrity, another had chosen spectacle. And the audience, watching it all unfold, had witnessed exactly what happens when those two forces collide.